Hey guys, tonight we're stepping through a portal into one of history's most romanticized, yet absolutely terrifying experiences, the medieval battlefield. You know the scene from every epic movie. Gleaming armor, noble knights, and heroic charges across green fields. But here's the thing: your comfortable modern life hasn't prepared you for. You're about to discover why you'd be dead before lunch on your very first day in actual medieval combat. Picture this: you wake up at dawn, and instead of checking your phone for notifications, you're handed a sword that weighs more than your laptop bag and told to march toward a field where several thousand angry people want to turn you into a very messy historical footnote. The romantic notions you've gathered from Game of Thrones are about to meet the harsh reality of 12th century warfare, and spoiler alert, reality wins every single time. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's always fascinating to see our global community settling in for some historically accurate nightmare fuel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in a medieval army camp just as the first pale light of dawn creeps across the horizon. The year is 1346, somewhere in northern France, and you've somehow found yourself conscripted into an English army preparing for what history will remember as the Battle of Crécy. But right now, all you know is that your stomach is churning, and not just from the questionable gruel you choked down for breakfast. The first thing that hits you isn't the sight or sound of preparation, it's the smell. Modern warfare might be brutal, but at least it doesn't assault your nostrils quite like this. You're breathing in a cocktail of unwashed bodies, rotting food scraps, horse manure, and something else you can't quite identify but suspect might be the remnants of yesterday's casualties. Medieval armies weren't exactly known for their sanitation standards, and after marching for weeks without proper washing facilities, thousands of men tend to develop what we might politely call a distinctive aroma. The stench is so overwhelming that you instinctively breathe through your mouth, which only makes things worse because now you can taste the air. It's like someone took a gym locker room, mixed it with a barnyard, threw in some rotting vegetables, and then decided to marinate the whole mess in human desperation for several weeks. You try to adjust, thinking this must be the worst part, but the smell is actually the least of your problems right now. Around you, soldiers are checking their equipment with the methodical precision of people who know their lives depend on every strap, buckle, and blade edge. These aren't the gleaming knights of Hollywood. Most of them are common foot soldiers like yourself, wearing whatever armor they could afford or salvage. Some sport leather jerkins reinforced with metal studs, others wear mail shirts that have seen better decades, and a few lucky souls have managed to acquire partial plate armor pieces that don't quite match. You watch them work and realize just how much skill goes into something as simple as putting on medieval armor. It's not like slipping into a jacket. Every piece has to be positioned precisely, secured properly, and adjusted for movement. The veterans around you accomplish this with muscle memory built over years of campaigning, their hands working straps and buckles without conscious thought while their eyes scan for threats and their ears monitor the constant flow of information passing through the camp. You look down at your own gear and feel the first real wave of panic. The sword in your hand feels alien and unwieldy, nothing like the lightweight prop swords from movies. This is 3 feet of actual steel, designed to hack through bone and sinew, and it's heavier than anything you've ever held for more than a few minutes. The blade has nicks and scratches that tell stories of previous battles, previous owners who may or may not have survived to pass it down. Your shield, A simple wooden affair reinforced with leather and metal studs already makes your arm ache just from holding it in a ready position. The weight distribution is completely wrong for your modern sensibilities. Your arms are accustomed to lifting laptops and coffee cups, not maintaining combat readiness with several pounds of metal for hours at a time. Already, you can feel the burn starting in your shoulders and forearms, and the actual fighting hasn't even begun. The leather grip on your sword is slick with sweat, yours and probably several previous owners, and you're terrified of losing control of the weapon in actual combat. The noise around you is building to a crescendo that would make a construction site seem peaceful. Men are shouting orders in dialects you can barely understand. Horses are whinnying and stamping, and somewhere in the distance, you can hear the ominous sound of enemy horns answering your own army's calls. It's like the world's most terrifying orchestra tuning up for a performance where the audience participation involves sharp objects. But it's not just the volumites, the quality of the sounds. There's an edge of barely controlled panic in many voices, the kind of tension that comes when thousands of people are about to engage in mortal combat. Horses sense the mood and become skittish, their hooves creating a constant drumbeat against the hard-packed earth. Metal clinks against metal as weapons are tested and adjusted. Leather creaks under the strain of heavy equipment. And underneath it all, you hear something that makes your blood run cold, the sound of men praying. Your captain, a grizzled veteran whose face looks like it's been used as a practice target for various medieval weapons, approaches your group of new recruits. His left eye is milky with cataracts. His right hand is missing 2 fingers, and when he speaks, you can see gaps where teeth used to be. He takes one look at you and shakes his head with the weary expression of a man who's seen too many fresh faces become tomorrow's corpses. Listen up, you worthless maggots. He growls in an accent thick as porridge. Most of you won't see sunset, but maybe I can keep a few of you breathing long enough to be useful. His voice carries the authority of someone who's survived at least a dozen battles, and when he speaks, even the veteran soldiers stop their preparations to listen. First rule, stay with your brothers. Second rule, keep your shield up. Third rule, when I tell you to advance, you advance. When I tell you to hold, you hold. When I tell you to retreat, you run like the hounds of hell are chasing you, because they probably are. He walks down the line of new recruits, examining each one with the practiced eye of someone who can calculate life expectancy at a glance. When he reaches you, he stops and stares for a long moment. You, he says finally, have the look of a man who's never seen blood spilled in anger. Am I right? You nod weakly, and he sighs. Thought so. Well, you'll either learn fast or die faster. Try not to embarrass yourself too much. Historians still argue whether medieval commanders actually cared about casualty rates among common soldiers, or if they simply viewed them as expendable resources in the grand chess game of warfare. What's certain is that your individual survival isn't high on anyone's priority list right now. You're essentially a walking weapon delivery system, expected to get close enough to the enemy to poke them with sharp metal before they return the favor. The battle formation begins to organize around you, and you realize just how little you understand about medieval military tactics. This isn't the chaotic free-for-all depicted in many film sets, a carefully orchestrated dance of death where every man has a specific role. Archers are positioning themselves for optimal range and coverage, their longbows as tall as they are and strung with hemp that could probably lift a small car. Cavalry units are forming up for charges, their destriers snorting and pawing the ground with hooves the size of dinner plates. Infantry like yourself are being arranged in tight formations designed to present a wall of spears and shields to the advancing enemy. You're assigned to the third rank of a formation that stretches dozens of men wide and 4 men deep. Your job, according to the sergeant who positions you, is to step forward when the man in front of you falls and to thrust your spear at anything wearing the wrong colors. It sounds simple enough until you realize that when the man in front of you falls is treated as an absolute certainty, not a possibility. But here's where your modern sensibilities start to betray you completely. You keep looking around for the medic stations, the supply trucks, the radio communications, all the support systems that make modern warfare at least theoretically survivable. Instead, you see a handful of barber surgeons sharpening their bone saws and a few camp followers boiling water in cauldrons that have definitely seen better days. That's your entire medical support system right there. The barber surgeons are setting up their stations with the efficiency of people who know they're about to be very busy. They're laying out tools that look more like torture implements than medical instruments: curved knives for cutting flesh, bone saws with teeth like sharks, iron pincers for extracting arrowheads, and cauterizing irons already heating in small fires. There are no anesthetics beyond strong alcohol, no antibiotics, no sterile procedures. A minor wound that modern medicine could treat with a bandage and antiseptic cream becomes a potential death sentence in this era. The psychological weight of what's about to happen begins to settle on your shoulders like a lead blanket. In your modern life, violence is abstract, something you see on screens or read about in news articles. The most dangerous thing you regularly encounter might be rush hour traffic or a particularly aggressive customer service representative. But now you're surrounded by men who have spent their entire lives preparing for organized violence. And they're all carrying weapons specifically designed to end human life as efficiently as possible. You notice how the veteran soldiers move differently from the recruits. There's an economy of motion, a conservation of energy that speaks to hard-won experience. They don't waste movement or effort on unnecessary actions. When they check their weapons, it's with the thoroughness of a surgeon examining instruments. When they adjust their armor, every strap and buckle receives attention because they know that a loose piece of equipment can mean death in combat. A trumpet sounds somewhere ahead of you, and the entire army begins to move. Not the dramatic charge you might expect, but a slow, methodical advance across terrain that immediately proves treacherous to your modern footwear. Medieval battlefields weren't the smooth, grassy plains of movie battles. They were muddy, uneven expanses full of holes, rocks, and obstacles that could turn an ankle or trip an unwary soldier at the worst possible moment. Your modern athletic shoes, designed for treadmills and sidewalks, provide absolutely no support on this kind of ground. Every step threatens to send you tumbling, and the weight of your equipment makes maintaining balance a constant struggle. You watch the veterans around you navigate the same terrain with practiced ease, their feet finding solid purchase where yours slip and slide. As you march, you notice that seasoned soldiers are constantly scanning the ground, the sky, and the enemy positions with an awareness that comes from years of survival instinct. They know how to read the subtle signs that might mean the difference between life and death, the flight patterns of birds that might indicate enemy archers, the sound of hoofbeats that could signal cavalry, the way light reflects off armor at different distances. One veteran catches your eye and points to a flock of crows rising suddenly from the field ahead. Cavalry coming from the left flank. He says matter-of-factly, "Birds don't like horses." Sure enough, moments later you hear the thunder of hooves approaching from that direction. This kind of battlefield awareness is completely foreign to your modern experience. but it represents the difference between survival and becoming fertilizer for next year's crops. You, meanwhile, are struggling just to keep your footing while managing your unwieldy equipment. The sword keeps tangling with your legs. The shield throws off your balance. And you're already breathing hard from the physical exertion of simply moving in gear that weighs more than your entire modern wardrobe. Sweat is pouring down your face and soaking into padding that wasn't particularly clean to begin with. This is just the approach march. The actual fighting hasn't even started yet. The enemy army becomes visible across the field, and your blood turns to ice water in your veins. They look exactly like your own thousands of armed men arranged in fighting formations, ready to kill or be killed for causes you don't fully understand and politics that were decided by people who will never set foot on this battlefield. The banners fluttering above their ranks might as well be foreign languages, representing alliances and feuds that stretch back generations. This is the moment when the romantic notion of medieval warfare dies a quick, brutal death in your mind. There's nothing noble or heroic about what's about to unfold. It's simply organized violence on a massive scale, where success is measured in body counts and survival often comes down to pure, dumb luck. Your modern education, your technological advantages, your enlightened worldview, none of it matters here. You're just another piece of meat in the medieval military machine, and the grinder is about to start turning. The distance between the armies begins to close, and you can make out individual faces among the enemy ranks. They look as terrified as you feel, which somehow makes the whole situation even more surreal. These aren't monsters or demonstri, just men like yourself, caught up in the same inexorable machinery of medieval warfare. In a different time and place, you might have shared a drink with them. Today, you're going to try to kill each other. The final horn sounds, and 20,000 men begin their advance toward mutual destruction under a sky that couldn't care less about the human drama playing out below. Your legs feel like water, your hands shake uncontrollably, and somewhere in the distance, you can hear someone vomiting from pure terror. Welcome to medieval warfare. Try not to die too quickly. The first piece of equipment that's going to kill you isn't actually a weapon, it's your armor. Right now, as you stumble across the battlefield in your hastily fitted gear, you're discovering what medieval warriors learned through years of brutal experience. Protection comes with a price that your soft modern body simply cannot pay. That mail shirt you're wearing? It weighs about 30 pounds, which doesn't sound like much until you realize it's 30 pounds of metal rings hanging from your shoulders, pulling downward with every step. The weight isn't distributed evenly like a modern backpack, it's concentrated on your neck and shoulders, creating pressure points that are already sending shooting pains down your spine. Within minutes of serious movement, you'll feel like you're being slowly crushed by an invisible vice. But the weight is just the beginning of your problems. Medieval armor was designed for medieval bodiesmen who had spent their entire lives building the specific muscle groups needed to fight in heavy equipment. Your modern physique, shaped by desk jobs and gym memberships, is completely unprepared for this kind of sustained physical stress. The veterans around you move with fluid grace in similar gear because their bodies have adapted over decades of training. You, on the other hand, are about to discover that wearing armor is a skill in itself. The mail shirt is constructed from thousands of interlocking iron rings, each one individually forged and linked to its neighbors in an intricate pattern that took a craftsman weeks to complete. It's a marvel of medieval engineering, but it's also a torture device masquerading as protection. Each ring weighs just a few grams, but multiply that by thousands and you're carrying the equivalent of a small motorcycle engine hanging from your shoulders. The rings themselves are constantly in motion, shifting and grinding against each other with every movement you make. This creates a subtle but persistent vibration that resonates through your bones, like wearing a very heavy, very expensive chainsaw around your torso. The constant metal-on-metal contact produces a sound that enemy soldiers can hear from dozens of yards away. So much for stealth. You're essentially wearing a dinner bell that announces your location to anyone who wants to practice their sword work on a slow-moving target. Underneath the mail, you're wearing a padded gambesona thick jacket stuffed with layers of linen or wool that's supposed to cushion the impact of blows and prevent the mail rings from digging into your flesh. In theory, it's brilliant. In practice, it's like wearing a winter coat in a sauna while someone drops bowling balls on your shoulders. The padding soaks up sweat like a sponge and retains it like a sponge, creating a personal humidity chamber that would make a Florida summer seem comfortable. The helmet perched on your head is perhaps the most dangerous piece of equipment you're carrying, and that's saying something considering you're also armed with several sharp metal objects. Medieval helmets were marvels of protective engineering, but they came with trade-offs that modern safety equipment has trained you to expect don't exist. Your vision is reduced to narrow slits that provide maybe 60% of your normal field of view. Peripheral vision, that crucial survival tool that alerts you to incoming threats, has been virtually eliminated. This particular Helmeta basic bassinet with an aventail of mail protecting your neck wasn't designed for your head shape. Medieval armorers made equipment to fit their local clientele, and your modern skull proportions are apparently quite different from those of 14th century English soldiers. The helmet rocks slightly with each step, threatening to slip down over your eyes at the worst possible moment. The chin strap digs into your jaw, the padding presses against your temples, and there's a persistent ringing in your ears from the metal resonating with every impact of your feet against the ground. Worse yet, the helmet's weight, another 10 pounds of steel, sits directly on top of your skull, transmitted through a thin layer of padding that does little to distribute the pressure. Your neck muscles, accustomed to supporting just your head, are now struggling with nearly 50% additional weight. Every time you turn to look for threats, you're fighting against momentum that wants to keep your head moving in whatever direction you started. It's like trying to fight while wearing a bowling ball for a hat. The breathing situation inside your helmet is becoming critical faster than you anticipated. Each exhalation fogs the narrow eye slits, reducing your already limited vision even further. The metal conducts heat like a furnace, turning your head into a personal sauna. Sweat pours down your face with nowhere to go, pooling in the bottom of the helmet and creating a disgusting broth of salt water and whatever was living in the padding before you put it on. The previous owner of this helmet apparently had some interesting dietary habits, because there's a persistent aroma of garlic, old cheese, and something that might have been fish sauce wafting up from the padding. You're essentially trapped in someone else's personal hygiene disaster, breathing recycled air that's been filtered through decades of medieval dental care and questionable grooming practices. And then there's the noise problem. Medieval helmets essentially turn your head into an echo chamber, amplifying every sound from inside while muffling crucial audio information from outside. Your own breathing sounds like a bellows, your heartbeat thunders in your ears, and the clanking of your equipment creates a constant din that masks approaching footsteps, shouted warnings, or the whistle of incoming arrows. You're essentially fighting blind and deaf in a situation where split-second awareness means the difference between life and death. Your hands, enclosed in thick leather gloves reinforced with metal plates, have lost most of their dexterity. The gloves were clearly made for someone with different proportions. The fingers are too long, the palm too narrow, and the thumb sits at an angle that makes gripping anything a constant struggle. Medieval warriors trained for years to maintain weapon control while wearing gloves, developing calluses and muscle memory that allowed them to manipulate their equipment with precision. You're discovering that even simple actions like adjusting your grip or drawing a secondary weapon become nearly impossible tasks when your fingers are encased in medieval mittens. The leather is stiff with age and previous owner's sweat, creating inflexible tubes that turn your fingers into clumsy sausages. The metal reinforcement plates, designed to protect your knuckles and the backs of your hands, add weight and bulk that throws off your entire sense of touch. You can't feel the texture of your weapon's grip, can't gauge how tightly you're holding it, can't make the subtle adjustments that keep a sword properly oriented in your hand. The shield strapped to your left arm is becoming less of a protective device and more of a torture implement with each passing minute. The leather straps that secure it to your forearm are cutting off circulation, turning your fingers numb and cold. The shields weigh another 15 pounds of wood, leather, and metallese transmitted through your arm to your shoulder, which is already screaming from the mail shirt's burden. Your left arm is effectively useless for anything except holding the shield in roughly the right position, and even that's becoming doubtful. This shield is a heater shield, designed in the classic kite shape that was popular during the Crusades. It's painted with colors that might once have been bright but are now faded to indistinct muddy hues. The leather facing is cracked and worn. The wooden core shows signs of previous impacts, and the metal boss in the center has a dent that suggests the last person to use this shield had a very bad day. Medieval warriors understood that shields weren't just passive protection, they were active weapons that required strength, skill, and constant adjustment to be effective. You need to be able to angle the shield to deflect incoming blows, use it to bash opponents, and coordinate its position with your sword work. Instead, you're barely managing to keep it upright while the weight slowly drains your strength and the awkward grip sends cramps shooting through your forearm. The shield straps are positioned for someone with longer arms and a different shoulder width. Every time you try to bring it into a proper defensive position, catches on your mail shirt or bumps against your helmet. The rim keeps drifting down to block your already limited vision, and the awkward angle puts constant strain on your wrist and elbow joints. But here's where medieval weapon design really shows its cruel efficiency. Every piece of equipment your enemies carry has been specifically engineered to exploit the weaknesses in your protection. That sword blade glinting in the morning sun isn't just a sharp stick, it's a precision instrument designed to find gaps in armor, slide between mail rings, and punch through weak points with devastating effectiveness. Medieval swords were evolutionary marvels of metallurgy and design, refined through centuries of arms races between weapon makers and armor smiths. The blade geometry, the weight distribution, the grip design, every aspect has been optimized for killing people wearing exactly the kind of protection you're struggling with right now. A skilled swordsman can thread a blade between the plates of your armor with surgical precision, finding joints and gaps that you didn't even know existed. The crossbow bolts that enemy soldiers are loading into their weapons represent another level of technological nightmare for someone in your position. These aren't the sporting arrows you might have seen at a modern archery rangetheory short. Heavy projectiles called quarrels, designed to punch through armor like it's made of paper. The business end is a bodkin-pointed needle-sharp spike of hardened steel that concentrates all the crossbow's energy into a contact point smaller than a pencil tip. The crossbow itself stores enough energy to drive these bolts completely through a mail shirt, the person wearing it, and probably the person standing behind them. The mechanical advantage of the crossbow's lever system allows even a relatively weak person to generate enormous kinetic energy. Bad news for you. since you're about to be on the receiving end of several dozen such weapons. Historians still argue whether crossbows were actually banned by the Church in 1139 as too inhumane for use against Christians, but what's certain is that medieval warriors recognized them as game-changing weapons that made traditional armor significantly less effective. The Pope's alleged ban was probably more about controlling a weapon that allowed peasants to kill knights from a safe distance than any humanitarian concerns. Your enemies are also carrying an assortment of specialized anti-armor weapons that medieval warfare developed specifically to deal with people dressed like you. War hammers with spiked heads designed to concentrate enormous force on tiny contact points, capable of denting helmets and concussing the brains inside. The spike on the back of the hammerhead can punch through mail rings like a can opener, while the flat face delivers crushing blows that can break bones even through armor. Maces with flanged heads that focus impact energy through multiple metal ridges, turning even a glancing blow into a bone-crushing experience. These weapons don't need to penetrate your armor to kill you, they just need to hit hard enough to turn your insides into jelly through blunt force trauma. A mace blow to your helmet might not crack the metal, but it can certainly scramble the contents. Then there are the poleaxe weapons that combine the cutting power of an axe, the piercing ability of a spear point, and the crushing force of a hammer into one versatile killing tool. These weapons were the medieval equivalent of a Swiss Army knife, except every tool was designed to end human life in a different creative way. A skilled poleaxe user can hook your armor, pull you off balance, and then deliver a killing blow before you've figured out which end of your sword to hold. The axe blade can cleave through mail rings and deliver devastating cuts to exposed areas. The hammerhead can crush bones and dent armor. The spear point can thrust through gaps in protection or puncture weak spots. And the hook on the back can catch your shield, your weapon, or even parts of your armor and use them against you. It's like facing someone who's armed with an entire medieval arsenal on a 6-foot handle. The really insidious thing about medieval armor is how it fails when it fails. Modern safety equipment is designed to fail Sophia motorcycle helmet cracks and absorbs impact. A safety harness stretches and distributes force. Medieval armor, when it's overwhelmed, tends to become part of the problem. A dented helmet can trap your head in a vice-like grip. A punctured mail shirt creates sharp metal fragments that cut you as you move. Broken straps leave pieces of armor dangling where they can tangle your movements or provide handholds for enemies. When a crossbow bolt hits your mail shirt with enough force, it doesn't just penetrate, it pushes rings of metal into the wound, creating a nasty puncture filled with foreign debris. The wound channel becomes infected almost immediately, and removing the embedded metal rings requires surgical procedures that won't be invented for another few centuries. Even if you survive the initial impact, the secondary damage from the armor failure will probably kill you slowly over the following days. Your boots, already proving inadequate for the terrain, represent another critical failure point that medieval warfare will exploit ruthlessly. The leather soles provide no traction on muddy ground, and the lack of ankle support makes every step a potential disaster. Medieval soldiers wore specialized footwear designed for combat: shoes with hobnails for traction, boots with reinforced ankles, and sometimes even specialized spikes for fighting on ice or in mud. Your modern footwear, designed for sidewalks and gym floors, has absolutely no grip on the mixture of mud, grass, and increasingly frequent patches of blood that characterize a medieval battlefield. Every step threatens to send you sliding, and maintaining balance while wearing dozens of pounds of shifting metal becomes an increasingly desperate struggle. When you inevitably slip and fall in your inadequate footwear, your armor transforms from protection into a death trap. The weight that was merely exhausting while you were upright becomes impossible to manage when you're down. Rolling over in full armor requires specific techniques that take months to master. Getting back to your feet is nearly impossible without assistance. And while you're floundering on the ground like an overturned turtle, enemy soldiers are approaching with weapons specifically designed to finish off fallen opponents. Medieval warfare developed an entire category of weapons called rondel daggers, long, narrow blades designed specifically for penetrating the gaps in a fallen opponent's armor. These daggers could slip between helmet plates, through mail joints, or under the edges of armor pieces to deliver precise, fatal wounds to helpless enemies. It was considered perfectly acceptable to kill a fallen opponent, and most battles ended with soldiers methodically finishing off the wounded and disabled. The psychological impact of fighting in medieval armor adds another layer of torture to your experience. The restricted vision and hearing create a sense of isolation and claustrophobia that amplifies every fear. You can't see threats approaching from your flanks, can't hear warnings from your companions, can't even tell if you're about to step into a hole or onto uneven ground. It's like fighting while wearing a sensory deprivation chamber. Medieval warriors learned to trust their equipment through years of training and experience. They knew exactly how their armor moved, where its limitations were, and how to work within those constraints. You're discovering these limitations in real time during actual combat, which is roughly equivalent to learning to drive during the Indianapolis 500. The heat exhaustion building inside your armor is reaching dangerous levels faster than you expected. Medieval battles often lasted for hours, and warriors had to pace themselves carefully to avoid collapse from overheating. Your modern body, accustomed to climate-controlled environments and moisture-wicking fabrics, is completely unprepared for sustained physical activity while wrapped in metal and leather. Dehydration sets in quickly when you're sweating profusely inside armor that allows no evaporation. Your mouth becomes dry and sticky, your head starts to pound, and your vision begins to narrow, even further a dangerous combination when you need every advantage you can get. Medieval soldiers carried water, but accessing it while in full armor and under combat conditions requires practice and planning that you simply don't have. The water skin hanging from your belt might as well be on the moon for all the good it does you right now. Your armored hands can't manage the stopper. Your helmet prevents you from tilting your head back far enough to drink properly. And stopping to remove equipment in the middle of a battle is essentially committing suicide. You're gonna fight while slowly dying of thirst, just like thousands of medieval soldiers before you. The enemy is closing in now, and you're beginning to understand that your armor isn't going to save you, it's going to kill you slowly while they finish the job quickly. Every piece of protective equipment has become a liability. Every safety measure has transformed into a trap. Welcome to medieval warfare, where the gear designed to keep you alive might just be the most dangerous thing on the battlefield. While you're struggling with your equipment failures, something even more catastrophic is becoming apparent: your complete and utter lack of the physical conditioning required for medieval combat. You've spent your entire life in a world where the most strenuous daily activity might be carrying groceries up a flight of stairs, and now you're expected to engage in sustained, violent physical activity while wearing 60 pounds of metal. It's like training for a marathon by watching Netflix. Your cardiovascular system, optimized for modern sedentary life, is already screaming for mercy just from the approach march. Medieval warriors built their endurance through years of constant physical labor, farming, smithing, hauling stones, chopping wood, activities that created the kind of functional strength and stamina that no modern gym routine can replicate. Your ancestors worked from dawn to dusk, performing physically demanding tasks that would hospitalize most modern office workers. The veterans around you possess what medieval chroniclers called battle hardness, a combination of muscle memory, pain tolerance, and cardiovascular conditioning that allowed them to fight effectively for hours at a time. These men started training for combat as children, often beginning weapons practice around age 7. By the time they reached fighting age, they had developed not just the physical strength to wield medieval weapons, but the specific muscle groups and neural pathways needed to do so effectively under stress. You, meanwhile, are discovering that swinging a 3-pound sword for more than a few minutes produces a burning sensation in muscles you didn't know existed. Your shoulders, accustomed to typing and occasional weekend tennis, are cramping from the unfamiliar motion of maintaining a weapon in ready position. Your core muscles, which modern fitness culture has trained through planks and crunches, are completely unprepared for the rotational forces and weight distribution required for armored combat. Medieval swordsmanship isn't just about swinging a blade, it's a full-body activity that requires coordination between your feet, hips, torso, shoulders, and arms in complex patterns that take years to master. Every cut, thrust, and parry involves precise timing and body mechanics that become second nature only through countless hours of practice. You're trying to learn these movements while people are actively attempting to kill you, which is roughly equivalent to learning to perform surgery during an earthquake. The basic guard positions that form the foundation of medieval combat are biomechanically designed for bodies that have spent years adapting to these movements. The high guard, where you hold your sword above your head ready to deliver a powerful downward cut, requires shoulder flexibility and strength that your modern lifestyle has never developed. Your deltoids and trapezius muscles, weakened by years of hunching over computers, simply cannot maintain these positions for extended periods. Attempting to execute a proper medieval sword cut involves a complex kinetic chain that starts with your feet, travels through your legs and hips, engages your core muscles, and finally expresses itself through your arms and weapon. Medieval warriors learned to generate enormous cutting power through proper body mechanics, allowing relatively small men to deliver devastating blows that could shear through armor and bone. You, lacking this training, are essentially trying to fight with just your armsa approach that medieval combat manuals specifically warn against. Your cuts lack power, your thrusts lack penetration, and your defensive movements are telegraphed so obviously that experienced opponents can read your intentions from across the battlefield. It's like playing chess against a grandmaster when you've only just learned how the pieces move. The footwork required for medieval combat represents another dimension of training that your modern experience has never approached. Fighting in armor requires a specific gait and stance that maintains balance while allowing rapid changes of direction. Medieval warriors developed a shuffling step that kept their center of gravity low and their feet in constant contact with uncertain terrain. Your modern walking style, evolved for flat surfaces and stable footing, leaves you off balance and vulnerable with every step. You tend to lift your feet too high, shift your weight too completely from one leg to the other, and maintain a stance that's far too narrow for stability in armor. When combat begins and you need to move quickly while maintaining weapon control, these fundamental deficiencies will make you an easy target for opponents who learned proper movement as children. The shield work that medieval combat requires involves a completely different set of motor skills that your modern training has never addressed. A shield isn't just held in front of you, it must be actively maneuvered to intercept attacks from multiple angles while coordinating with your weapon movements. Medieval warriors could make split-second adjustments to shield position based on the subtle cues that indicated where an attack was coming from. This requires not just physical strength, but the kind of hand-eye coordination and spatial awareness that develops only through extensive practice. You need to be able to track multiple opponents simultaneously, predict the trajectory of incoming weapons, and position your shield to deflect attacks while leaving yourself positioned to counterattack. It's like playing three-dimensional chess while riding a bicycle, except the chess pieces are trying to kill you. Your reaction times, dulled by decades of modern life where the most dangerous thing you encounter might be a honking car horn, are catastrophically slow by medieval combat standards. Medieval warriors developed reflexes honed by constant exposure to physical danger, reflexes that could mean the difference between deflecting a sword blow and receiving a fatal wound. These men lived in a world where violence was a daily possibility, where a simple disagreement could escalate to bloodshed in seconds. Their nervous systems were calibrated for immediate, physical responses to threats. Your nervous system, shaped by modern safety and security, takes precious milliseconds to process threats and formulate responses, milliseconds that medieval combat simply doesn't allow. The weapons training that medieval warriors underwent from childhood created muscle memory patterns that functioned almost independently of conscious thought. A trained swordsman could parry an unexpected attack and deliver a counterattack before his conscious mind had fully processed what was happening. These responses were drilled through thousands of hours of practice until they became as automatic as breathing. You're trying to consciously control movements that should be instinctive, creating a delay between perception and action that makes you incredibly vulnerable. While you're thinking about how to respond to an attack, your opponent has already landed 3 more blows and moved on to his next target. Medieval combat training also developed pain tolerance that allowed warriors to continue fighting effectively while wounded. These men learned to compartmentalize injury, to continue functioning despite cuts, bruises, and broken bones that would incapacitate most modern people. They understood that showing weakness or hesitation in battle was often fatal, so they developed the mental discipline to push through pain and fear. Your modern pain responses, conditioned by a lifetime of avoiding discomfort and seeking immediate relief for minor injuries, are completely inappropriate for medieval combat. The first time you receive a serious blow, and in medieval warfare, that's measured in seconds rather than minutes, your body's pain response will likely overwhelm your ability to continue fighting effectively. The strength requirements for medieval weapons go far beyond what modern fitness routines typically develop. Medieval warriors needed not just raw power, but endurance strength, the ability to maintain high levels of force output for extended periods. A medieval battle could last for hours, during which warriors needed to continue swinging heavy weapons with enough force to penetrate armor and disable opponents. Your modern fitness, based on brief, intense workouts followed by recovery periods, is completely unsuited to this kind of sustained effort. Medieval warriors built their strength through functional activities that required prolonged exertion, activities like swinging hammers in smithies, pulling oars on ships, or working agricultural tools for entire days at a time. The grip strength alone required for medieval weapons would astonish most modern people. Medieval swords, axes, and maces had to be controlled precisely while delivering tremendous force, requiring forearm and hand strength that most contemporary athletes never develop. These warriors could maintain weapon control while their hands were slick with blood, sweat, and rain, conditions that would cause most modern people to lose their grip entirely. Historians still argue whether medieval warriors were actually stronger than modern athletes, or whether they simply developed strength in different, more practical ways. What's certain is that their strength was specifically adapted to the demands of combat. while modern fitness tends to focus on isolated muscle groups rather than functional, integrated movement patterns. The mental conditioning required for medieval combat represents perhaps the greatest gap between your modern experience and the requirements of battlefield survival. Medieval warriors were psychologically prepared for violence from childhood, having grown up in a world where physical conflict was a normal part of life. They had seen death, had killed animals for food, had witnessed executions and public punishments that were considered normal entertainment. Products of a civilization that has largely sanitized violence and death, are psychologically unprepared for the immediate, personal nature of medieval combat. The first time you see someone die violently in front of you and in medieval warfare, this happens within the first few minutes. Your mind will likely shut down in ways that no amount of theoretical preparation can prevent. Medieval warriors also developed what modern psychology might recognize as compartmentalization skills that allowed them to function in extremely stressful situations. They could witness horrors that would traumatize modern people while maintaining the focus and decision-making ability needed to survive. This wasn't callousness, it was a survival adaptation that allowed them to process violence and death without becoming paralyzed by trauma. Your modern stress responses, evolved for psychological rather than physical threats, are completely inappropriate for medieval combat situations. When faced with immediate physical danger, your body dumps adrenaline and other stress hormones into your system, but without the trained responses to channel that energy effectively, you're more likely to freeze or panic than to fight effectively. The social conditioning that made medieval warfare possible also created psychological frameworks that modern people lack entirely. Medieval warriors understood their role in a hierarchical system that gave meaning and context to violence. They fought for lord, land, and faith, concepts that provided psychological anchors during the chaos of battle. You lack these cultural frameworks entirely, making the violence you're experiencing seem random and meaningless rather than purposeful and justified. This psychological disorientation adds another layer of stress to an already overwhelming situation, making it even more difficult to function effectively in combat. The enemy soldiers approaching you have spent their entire lives preparing for this moment. Their bodies are conditioned, their minds are focused, their movements are trained to lethal efficiency. You're about to face warriors who represent the culmination of medieval military evolution, armed with skills and conditioning that took decades to develop. And you're trying to match them with a modern body that's never known real hardship, never experienced genuine violence, and never learned the brutal lessons that medieval survival required. It's not even a fair fight, it's a massacre waiting to happen. The moment the battle horn sounds its final call, something primal and terrifying happens to the human beings around you, and you're about to discover that your modern psychology is completely unprepared for the reality of mass combat. You've seen war movies, played violent video games, maybe even watched some mixed martial arts, but nothing in your experience has prepared you for the psychological apocalypse that is about to unfold on this medieval battlefield. The first thing that hits you isn't a weapon, it's the sound. 20,000 men releasing their battle cries simultaneously creates a wall of noise that seems to physically assault your eardrums. It's not just loud. It's a coordinated roar of human aggression that your ancestors would have recognized as the sound of impending death. Your modern ears, accustomed to traffic noise and construction sites, have never processed anything quite like this concentrated expression of violent intent. But it's not just the volume that's overwhelming, it's the quality of the sound. These aren't the sanitized battle cries of Hollywood films. These are the genuine sounds that humans make when they're preparing to kill or be killed. Guttural roars, animal howls, and screams that seem to bypass your rational mind entirely and speak directly to the most primitive parts of your brain. Some of the veterans around you are making sounds that don't seem entirely human, accessing vocal ranges and expressions that civilized society has trained out of most modern people. Your modern psychology, shaped by centuries of civilization that have moved violence to the abstract realm of entertainment and news reports, simply doesn't have the frameworks to process what's happening around you. The fight-or-flight response that evolution designed to help humans survive physical threats is misfiring catastrophically, flooding your system with stress hormones while providing no useful outlets for the energy they're generating. Medieval warriors understood something about the psychology of combat that modern people have largely forgotten. Battle is as much a mental state as a physical activity. They developed specific techniques for entering what medieval chroniclers called battle fury, a controlled psychological state that allowed them to function effectively in extreme violence while suppressing the normal human responses that would otherwise paralyze them. Some warriors achieved this through religious fervor, viewing combat as a holy mission that justified any level of violence. Others used alcohol, herbal preparations, or ritualistic behaviors to alter their consciousness before battle. The most experienced fighters could enter this state through pure mental discipline, essentially turning off the parts of their psyche that would normally recoil from violence and death. You, lacking any of these psychological tools, are experiencing the full, unfiltered impact of combat stress with no coping mechanisms except those designed for modern, civilized life. Your mind keeps trying to apply rational analysis to a situation that has moved far beyond the realm of reason, creating a cognitive dissonance that's almost as disabling as your physical limitations. The Viking berserkers, fighting alongside some of the Norman mercenaries in the enemy ranks, represent perhaps the most extreme example of medieval battle psychology. These warriors deliberately cultivated a form of controlled madness that allowed them to fight with superhuman intensity while feeling little to no pain. Whether they achieved this through drugs, religious practices, or pure psychological conditioning remains a subject of scholarly debate, but their effectiveness in combat was legendary. Watching a berserker in action is like witnessing someone who has temporarily stopped being entirely human. They move with fluid violence, seeming to anticipate attacks before they happen and responding with counterattacks that flow seamlessly from defense to offense. They show no signs of fatigue, fear, or pain, even when suffering wounds that would incapacitate normal fighters. Is simultaneously fascinating and absolutely terrifying to witness. Your modern mind keeps trying to categorize what you're seeing: mental illness, drug-induced psychosis, performance enhancement, but none of these frameworks adequately explain what you're witnessing. These aren't random acts of violence. They're highly trained, incredibly effective combat techniques that represent the culmination of medieval military psychology. The fear that's building in your chest isn't the manageable anxiety you might feel before a job interview or an important presentation. This is existential terror, the bone-deep recognition that you are about to die in ways that your comfortable modern life never prepared you to contemplate. Your body is producing adrenaline faster than your system can process it, creating a jittery, hyper-alert state that actually makes you less effective rather than more so. Medieval warriors learned to channel fear into functional aggression through years of conditioning and battlefield experience. They understood that fear was inevitable, but that it could be transformed into a useful emotional state that enhanced rather than hindered combat performance. Fear could sharpen reflexes, increase strength, and provide the motivation needed to commit fully to violent action. Your fear, however, is creating paralysis rather than empowerment. Your modern safety-focused upbringing has taught you that fear is a signal to retreat, to seek help, to avoid danger rather than confront it. These responses are completely counterproductive in medieval combat, where retreat often means death and the only help available is whatever you can provide for yourself. The proximity of death is becoming a tangible presence on the battlefield as the first casualties begin to fall. You watch men you were talking to moments ago suddenly collapse with arrows protruding from their chests, their faces registering surprise, pain, and then nothing at all. The transition from living human being to corpse happens so quickly that your mind struggles to process what you're witnessing. Modern life has largely sanitized death, relegating it to hospitals and funeral homes where it's managed by professionals and presented in carefully controlled contexts. You've probably never seen someone die violently, never watched the precise moment when consciousness leaves a human body, never had to step over fresh corpses to continue with your daily activities. Medieval warriors, by contrast, had intimate familiarity with death in all its forms. They had seen animals slaughtered for food, had witnessed public executions, had participated in battles where death was a constant companion. This familiarity didn't make them callous, but it did provide them with psychological frameworks for processing mortality that allowed them to continue functioning in its presence. The smell of battle is adding another layer of psychological assault to your experience. Blood has a distinctive metallic odor that becomes overwhelming when present in large quantities. Mixed with the smells of loosened bowels from men who have died violently, the acrid smoke from burning equipment, and the sweat and fear musk of thousands of terrified humans, the battlefield creates an olfactory environment that would be considered torture in any civilized context. Your modern nose, accustomed to air fresheners and deodorants, is being overwhelmed by scents that trigger deep, instinctive responses. The smell of blood activates ancient parts of your brain that associate it with danger and death. The other odors create a sensory overload that makes it difficult to think clearly or make rational decisions. Medieval warriors developed a kind of sensory filtering that allowed them to function despite these overwhelming inputs. They learned to compartmentalize their awareness, focusing on the immediate tactical situation while pushing disturbing sensory information into the background. This skill took years to develop and represented a crucial survival adaptation for anyone who wanted to live through multiple battles. The visual impact of medieval combat is proving equally devastating to your modern sensibilities. These aren't the clean deaths of movies and television, where people fall dramatically and then lie still. Medieval weapons create devastating wounds that continue bleeding, twitching, and making noise long after their victims have lost consciousness. Men with severed limbs continue trying to fight. Warriors with gaping wounds keep advancing until blood loss finally stops them. The human body's resilience in the face of trauma is both remarkable and horrifying to witness. Medieval medical knowledge understood that humans could survive incredible damage and continue functioning for surprising periods of time. Warriors would continue fighting with injuries that modern people would consider immediately fatal, driven by adrenaline, training, and the knowledge that stopping meant certain death. Your modern medical awareness actually makes this worse rather than better. You can recognize the signs of massive blood loss, internal injury, and impending death in the wounded around you, but you lack both the knowledge and the equipment to help them. Watching people die from injuries that modern medicine could easily treat adds a layer of frustrated helplessness to your psychological stress. The crowd psychology of medieval battle creates its own form of madness that spreads through the ranks like a contagion. When thousands of people are simultaneously experiencing extreme stress, violence, and fear, Their individual psychological states begin to merge into a collective mindset that can override personal judgment and moral restraints. You can feel this happening around you, a subtle shift in the atmosphere as individual soldiers begin to lose their personal identities and merge into a fighting unit that operates according to different psychological rules. Men who might be gentle fathers and considerate neighbors in civilian life are transforming into efficient killing machines driven by group dynamics and survival instinct. This crowd psychology can work in your favor if you're part of a cohesive, experienced unit, but it can also create panic and rout if fear becomes the dominant emotion. Medieval commanders understood that managing the psychological state of their troops was just as important as tactical positioning and equipment, because a demoralized army would collapse regardless of its material advantages. The enemy warriors you're facing have their own psychological advantages that compound your disadvantages. Many of them are fighting on familiar ground, defending territory they consider home. Others are motivated by religious fervor, viewing this battle as a holy mission sanctioned by God. Some are driven by the prospect of plunder and advancement, seeing combat as their path to wealth and status. These psychological frameworks provide them with meaning and context that make the violence seem purposeful rather than random. They understand why they're fighting, what they're fighting for, and what they stand to gain or lose based on the battle's outcome. This sense of purpose provides psychological anchoring that helps them maintain focus and determination even in extreme circumstances. You, meanwhile, are fighting for survival alone, a powerful motivator, but one that provides no larger context or meaning to help process the horror around you. Your modern individualistic mindset, which serves you well in civilian life, becomes a liability in medieval combat where unit cohesion and shared purpose are crucial for psychological resilience. Historians still argue whether medieval warriors actually experienced less psychological trauma from combat than modern soldiers, or whether they simply lacked the vocabulary and frameworks to discuss it. What's certain is that medieval society provided different support systems for processing violence, including religious contexts that could give meaning to suffering and community structures that honored military service. The mental preparation that medieval warriors underwent included exposure to violence from childhood, participation in increasingly serious conflicts as they matured, and gradual conditioning that built psychological resilience over time. They also had cultural models of heroic behavior that provided templates for how to act courageously in the face of death. Your modern upbringing, focused on safety, comfort, and conflict avoidance, has provided no preparation for the psychological demands you're now facing. Every instinct you've developed is telling you to flee, hide, or seek help from authorities' responses that will only get you killed faster in this environment. The realization that you're probably going to die is beginning to settle into your consciousness like a cold weight in your chest. This isn't the abstract awareness of mortality that occasionally crosses your mind during quiet moments. This is the immediate, visceral knowledge that your life is about to end violently and soon. Medieval warriors faced this same realization, but they had psychological frameworks for processing it that transformed fear into determination. Religious beliefs about afterlife, cultural concepts of honor and glory, and social expectations about courageous behavior all helped medieval fighters find meaning in death that made it bearable. Your modern secular worldview, while perfectly adequate for normal life, provides no comparable comfort in the face of imminent violent death. The psychological void this creates is almost as debilitating as your physical limitations, leaving you emotionally as well as physically unprepared for what's about to happen. The enemy is almost within weapon range now, And you can see the expressions on individual faces, expressions of controlled fury, grim determination, and predatory focus. These aren't monsters or demons. They're human beings who have transformed themselves into killing machines through training, conditioning, and psychological preparation that you simply don't possess. They're looking at you with the same clinical assessment that a surgeon might use to examine a patient, calculating exactly how to end your life with maximum efficiency and minimum risk to themselves. And the truly terrifying thing is that they have every advantage they need to do exactly that. The first blow you receive isn't even a direct hit, it's a glancing strike from a mace that catches the edge of your helmet and sends your head ringing like a church bell. But in medieval warfare, there's no such thing as a minor injury, because what passes for medical care in 1346 is essentially a death sentence with extra steps. That seemingly superficial head wound is already beginning to bleed freely, and medieval medicine has absolutely no understanding of concussion protocols, antiseptic procedures, or even basic wound cleaning. What you need right now is a CT scan, some ibuprofen, and maybe a few stitches. What you're going to get instead is a barber surgeon with dirty hands, rusty instruments, and medical theories that won't be proven wrong for another 400 years. The blood running down your face from the head wound is mixing with sweat and condensation inside your helmet, creating a sticky, blinding mess that makes seeing even more difficult than it already was. In a modern emergency room, this would be cleaned, assessed, and properly bandaged within minutes. Here, it's just going to keep bleeding until either the wound clots naturally or you bleed out, and medieval combat doesn't give you the luxury of time for natural healing. Medieval medical knowledge was a fascinating blend of classical texts, folk remedies, religious beliefs, and practical experience that often created treatments worse than the original problems. The barber surgeons treating battlefield injuries had learned their trade through apprenticeships rather than formal medical education, and their understanding of human anatomy was based more on tradition than observation. The concept of infection, arguably the deadliest aspect of medieval medicine, was completely misunderstood by medieval practitioners. They knew that wounds could corrupt and lead to death, but they attributed this to imbalances in bodily humors, miasmatic vapors, or divine punishment rather than bacterial contamination. Their treatments often involved introducing more contamination rather than preventing it. If you survive the immediate battle with nothing worse than that head wound, you'll still face a medical nightmare that would horrify modern doctors. The barber surgeon assigned to your unit will approach your injury with tools that haven't been properly sterilized, hands that haven't been washed, and techniques that actively increase your risk of infection. Medieval wound treatment typically began with probing the injury using fingers or instruments to assess damage and remove foreign objects. This probing would be done without anesthetic, without sterile technique, and often with tools that had just been used on other patients. The concept of cross-contamination simply didn't exist in medieval medical thinking. The standard treatment for bleeding involved applying various powders and poultices that were thought to balance the humors and promote healing. These might include crushed herbs, animal dung, ground gemstones, or even powdered mummies. Actual ground-up Egyptian mummies were considered a premium medical ingredient in medieval Europe. The therapeutic value of these treatments ranged from minimal to actively harmful. Your head wound would likely be treated with a mixture of wine and honey, one of the more effective medieval remedies. Since alcohol does have some antiseptic properties and honey has natural antibacterial compounds. However, the wine would be contaminated with various bacteria, the honey would be unprocessed and full of debris, and the application would be done with unwashed hands using dirty bandages. But let's say the mace blow was more serious, perhaps it cracked your skull or caused internal bleeding. Medieval surgery, such as it was, could sometimes handle external wounds, but internal injuries were essentially death sentences. Trepanation, drilling holes in the skull to relieve pressure, was practiced by medieval surgeons, but their understanding of when and how to perform it was rudimentary at best. The surgical instruments available to medieval practitioners would look more like torture devices to modern eyes. Bone saws with coarse teeth that would shatter as much bone as they cut. Cauterizing irons heated in open fires to temperatures that varied wildly. Crude forceps and pincers that could extract foreign objects but often caused more damage in the process. Anesthesia, as we understand it, simply didn't exist in medieval medicine. The strongest pain relief available was alcohol, opium-based preparations that were rare and expensive, or herbal mixtures that provided minimal relief. Most surgical procedures were performed on fully conscious patients who were held down by assistants while surgeons worked as quickly as possible. The mortality rate for medieval surgery was catastrophic by modern standards. Even simple procedures like setting broken bones or treating deep cuts had infection rates approaching 100%. Major surgery, removal of arrows, treatment of internal injuries, or amputation of damaged limbs was almost invariably fatal, though death might take days or weeks to arrive. Historians still argue whether medieval medicine actually killed more patients than it saved. But what's certain is that surviving serious injury in medieval times required remarkable luck, an exceptional constitution, and divine intervention according to contemporary accounts. The medical establishment of the time was more likely to hasten death than prevent it. If your wound becomes infected, and medieval wounds almost always became infectidiary, facing a progression of symptoms that medieval medicine was powerless to stop. First comes the fever, as your body attempts to fight off bacterial invasion. Medieval doctors would interpret this as an excess of hot humors and might attempt to cool you down with cold baths or bloodletting, treatments that would actually weaken your immune response. The wound itself would begin to suppurate, producing the thick, colored discharge that medieval medicine actually considered a positive sign of healing. They believed that pus indicated the body was expelling corrupted humors, so they would often manipulate wounds to increase pus production rather than trying to prevent or clean it. As the infection spreads through your bloodstream, a condition modern medicine calls sepsis, you'd experience chills, confusion, and organ failure. Medieval doctors might interpret these symptoms as demonic possession, divine punishment, or planetary influences, depending on their particular theoretical framework. Their treatments might involve exorcism, prayer, astrological calculations, or bloodletting. Bloodletting deserves special mention as perhaps the most consistently harmful practice in medieval medicine. The theory held that many diseases were caused by excess blood or corrupted blood, so removing blood would restore balance to the system. This was done through various methods: cutting veins with lancets, applying leeches, or using cupping glasses to draw blood through suction. For someone already weakened by injury and infection, bloodletting was often the final straw that pushed them into irreversible shock. Medieval doctors would continue bleeding patients even as they grew weaker, interpreting their deterioration as evidence that more blood needed to be removed rather than recognizing that the treatment itself was causing harm. The pain management available in medieval medicine was primitive beyond modern comprehension. Serious injuries that modern medicine could treat with powerful, targeted pain relievers would be managed with whatever herbal preparations were available locally. These might include willow bark, which does contain salicin, a compound related to aspirin, poppy preparations, which contain opiates, or various alcoholic tinctures. However, the dosing of these preparations was inconsistent, their purity was questionable, and their availability was limited. Most medieval patients simply endured pain that would be considered intolerable by modern standards, relying on mental discipline, religious faith, or alcohol to cope with suffering that continued for weeks or months. Medieval understanding of anatomy was based largely on classical texts rather than direct observation, since human dissection was restricted by religious and cultural taboos. This meant that surgical procedures were often based on theoretical knowledge that didn't match biological reality, leading to interventions that caused more harm than they prevented. The four humors theory: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile dominated medieval medical thinking and led to treatments that attempted to balance these theoretical substances rather than addressing actual pathological processes. A wound infection might be treated as an excess of hot, moist humors, leading to cooling and drying treatments that actually impaired healing. If your injury required amputation, perhaps that mace blow shattered your arm beyond repair. Medieval surgical techniques would horrify modern medical professionals. Amputation was performed without proper anesthetic, using saws and knives that weren't sterile, and with minimal understanding of proper tissue management or postoperative care. The procedure itself would involve cutting through skin, muscle, and bone as quickly as possible while you remained conscious, screaming and struggling against restraints. The bone would be sawed through with tools that would leave rough, splintered edges. Blood vessels would be sealed by burning them with hot irons, a process that destroyed healthy tissue along with damaged vessels. Postoperative care consisted mainly of changing bandages occasionally and hoping for the best. There were no antibiotics to prevent infection, no proper pain management, and no understanding of proper wound care. The mortality rate for medieval amputations approached 90%, with most patients dying from infection, blood loss, or shock within days of the procedure. Even if you somehow survived the immediate effects of medieval surgery, the long-term consequences would be devastating by modern standards. Amputees received no rehabilitation therapy, no prosthetics beyond crude wooden attachments, and no ongoing medical care. Survivors were often left disabled and dependent on charity for survival. The psychological aspects of medieval medical care were equally primitive. There was no understanding of trauma, no concept of psychological support, and no recognition that mental health affected physical recovery. Patients who developed what we would now recognize as PTSD, depression, or anxiety disorders were often considered possessed, cursed, or simply weak-willed. Medieval hospitals, when they existed, were primarily religious institutions focused on spiritual rather than medical care. The emphasis was on preparing souls for the afterlife rather than healing bodies for continued earthly existence. Medical treatment was secondary to religious comfort, and many hospitals were essentially hospices where people went to die rather than recover. The pharmacological knowledge available to medieval practitioners was extremely limited compared to modern medicine. Most treatments were based on local plants and minerals, with dosing determined by tradition rather than scientific study. There was no understanding of drug interactions, allergic reactions, or proper dosing protocols. Many medieval medicines were actually poisonous substances that created additional health problems rather than solving existing ones. Mercury preparations were used to treat various conditions despite their obvious toxicity. Lead-based compounds were considered therapeutic. Arsenic was prescribed for numerous ailments. The diagnostic capabilities of medieval medicine were virtually non-existent by modern standards. Doctors relied on examining urine color, feeling pulse rates, and observing general symptoms to diagnose conditions. There was no understanding of internal anatomy, no ability to see inside the body, and no laboratory testing to confirm diagnoses. That head wound you received at the beginning of this section? In medieval medical care, it represents a cascade of potential complications that your body will have to overcome entirely through its own resources. The medical establishment of the time is more likely to kill you than help you, and your survival will depend entirely on luck, constitution, and factors that medieval medicine doesn't understand and can't control. Welcome to medieval healthcare, where the cure is often worse than the disease, and surviving treatment requires surviving your doctors first. The weather conditions that seemed like minor inconveniences when you first arrived on the battlefield are rapidly transforming into deadly tactical factors that medieval armies understood intimately, and that your modern experience has left you completely unprepared to handle. Right now, what started as a light morning drizzle is turning into a steady rain that's making every surface treacherous and every movement a potential disaster. Medieval commanders planned their campaigns around weather patterns with the obsessive attention that modern generals devote to air superiority, because they understood that nature could be a more dangerous enemy than any human opponent. The English longbowmen at battles like Agincourt deliberately chose positions that would put wind and rain at their backs, giving their arrows extra range while hampering enemy missile fire. Your current position has no such advantageous fighting uphill, into the wind, on ground that's turning to mud with every passing minute. The rain that's now soaking through your equipment isn't the gentle shower you might enjoy from the safety of a covered porch. This is medieval rain, falling on a battlefield churned by thousands of feet, hooves, and the iron wheels of supply wagons. The ground beneath your feet is transforming from solid earth into a slippery morass that threatens your balance with every step. Your modern athletic shoes, designed for traction on gym floors and sidewalks, are proving catastrophically inadequate for medieval battlefield conditions. The synthetic materials that work perfectly in controlled environments have no grip whatsoever on mud mixed with blood, crushed vegetation, and the detritus of medieval warfare. Every step threatens to send you sliding into the weapons of nearby combatants. Medieval warriors wore specialized footwear designed specifically for these conditions. Their leather boots featured hobnails, cleats, or other traction devices that could maintain grip even on treacherous terrain. Some even wore different footwear for different combat conditions: spiked shoes for ice, hobnailed boots for mud, or specialized climbing gear for siege warfare. The veterans around you are adapting their fighting styles to accommodate the changing conditions, shortening their steps, lowering their centers of gravity, and modifying their attacks to account for uncertain footing. These adjustments are second nature to men who have fought in dozens of different weather conditions, but they represent entirely new skills that you're trying to learn while people are actively attempting to kill you. The rain is also affecting your vision in ways that medieval helmet design makes significantly worse. Water is collecting on the narrow eye slits of your helmet and running down into your eyes, mixing with sweat and blood to create a stinging, blinding cocktail that makes seeing anything clearly nearly impossible. The metal surfaces of your helmet are becoming slippery, making the already unwieldy headgear even more difficult to control. Medieval battles were often decided by weather conditions that modern armies could easily overcome with proper equipment and preparation. The Byzantine army that attempted to recapture Italy from the Ostrogoths was decimated not by enemy action, but by a sudden winter storm that caught them without proper cold weather gear. Entire campaigns have been ended by unexpected weather changes that made movement impossible or supplies undeliverable. The wind that's picking up is creating its own tactical nightmare for anyone trying to use ranged weapons. Medieval archers were skilled at calculating wind drift and adjusting their aim accordingly, but this required years of practice and intimate familiarity with their equipment. The crossbow bolts flying around you are being pushed off course by gusts that medieval warriors could read like books but that you can't even see coming. Your own attempts to defend yourself are being complicated by wind that catches your shield at unexpected angles, threatens to rip your weapon from your grip, and makes maintaining balance even more precarious than it already was. Medieval shields were designed with wind resistance in mind, featuring curved surfaces and grip systems that allowed warriors to maintain control even in strong gusts. The temperature is dropping as the storm intensifies, and your body's response to cold is creating additional problems that medieval warfare is perfectly positioned to exploit. Your muscles are beginning to stiffen, reducing your already limited mobility and making your movements even more telegraphed and predictable. Your fingers, already clumsy in medieval gloves, are becoming numb and increasingly unresponsive. Medieval warriors understood that cold weather fighting required different techniques and preparations. They knew how to maintain body heat through movement patterns that conserved energy while keeping muscles loose and responsive. They understood which foods provided sustained energy in cold conditions and how to layer clothing and armor for maximum warmth without sacrificing mobility. Your modern cold weather experience, based on heated buildings and insulated clothing, has provided no preparation for sustained physical activity in medieval gear during a winter storm. The combination of metal armor that conducts heat away from your body, wet clothing that increases heat loss, and physical exertion that makes you sweat and then freeze is creating a perfect storm of hypothermia risk. The ground conditions are becoming increasingly treacherous as the rain continues. What started as firm earth has become a slippery mixture of mud, water, and increasingly disturbing organic matter from battle casualties. Medieval battlefields quickly became landscapes that would challenge even modern all-terrain vehicles, with obstacles and hazards that could disable or kill unwary fighters. Medieval armies developed specialized techniques for fighting on difficult terrain. They knew how to use muddy conditions to their advantage, how to position troops to take advantage of slope and drainage, and how to modify their tactics based on ground conditions. Some armies even carried specialized equipment for improving traction or creating stable fighting platforms in difficult terrain. The mud that's now coating everything isn't just making movement difficult, it's actively degrading your equipment in ways that medieval warfare is designed to exploit. Your sword grip is becoming slippery and unreliable. Your shield is accumulating weight as mud sticks to its surface. Your armor joints are collecting debris that makes movement increasingly difficult. Medieval warriors maintained their equipment constantly during campaigns, understanding that weapon reliability could mean the difference between life and death. They carried oils and cleaning materials specifically designed for wet weather conditions, and they knew techniques for maintaining gear functionality even in adverse conditions. Your lack of equipment maintenance knowledge is becoming critical as conditions deteriorate. The sword you're carrying is beginning to show rust spots where the protective oils have been washed away by rain. The leather components of your armor are becoming waterlogged and stretching, changing the fit and reducing the protection they provide. The visibility problems created by the weather are compounding your already serious situational awareness deficits. Medieval battles were often decided by commanders who could see and react to changing tactical conditions faster than their opponents. Your ability to assess threats, identify opportunities, or even maintain contact with friendly forces is being systematically degraded by weather conditions. Medieval armies used various signaling systems designed to work in adverse weather conditions. Horn calls, banner signals, and drum beats could communicate over distances and through conditions that made visual communication impossible. Understanding these signals required training that you simply don't have. The psychological impact of fighting in deteriorating weather conditions adds another layer of stress to an already overwhelming situation. The combination of physical discomfort, reduced capability, and increased danger creates a sense of helplessness that can be as disabling as any physical injury. Medieval warriors were psychologically prepared for adverse conditions through experience and training that exposed them to discomfort and hardship from childhood. They understood that weather was simply another tactical factor to be managed rather than a catastrophe to be endured. Historians still argue whether medieval armies were actually more resilient in adverse weather conditions, or whether they simply lacked alternatives to fighting regardless of conditions. What's certain is that medieval military culture treated weather adaptability as a crucial skill rather than an optional capability. The storm that's building around you represents forces that medieval armies understood were beyond human control but not beyond human adaptation. Successful medieval commanders learned to work with natural conditions rather than against them, using weather as a tactical tool rather than allowing it to become a strategic liability. The enemy forces are adapting to the changing conditions with practiced ease, maintaining formation and effectiveness despite the deteriorating weather. Their experience fighting in adverse conditions is showing as they adjust their tactics, modify their movements, and continue pressing their attack without the hesitation and confusion that weather is causing in your ranks. Your modern expectation that adverse conditions should halt combat or at least provide time for shelter and recovery is completely inappropriate for medieval warfare. Medieval battles continued through conditions that would ground modern aircraft and halt contemporary military operations, because medieval armies had no choice but to fight regardless of weather. The rain is intensifying now, driven by winds that are making every surface slippery and every movement uncertain. The battlefield is becoming a nightmare landscape of mud, blood, and obstacles that would challenge even modern military equipment. And you're trying to navigate it while wearing medieval armor, carrying medieval weapons, and lacking any of the skills that medieval survival required. The weather that seemed like a minor inconvenience when you first arrived has become another enemy on a battlefield where you already face overwhelming odds. Welcome to medieval warfare, where nature itself conspires to kill you, and surviving the weather is just the first challenge in staying alive. While you're struggling with equipment failures, physical inadequacy, psychological terror, medical nightmares, and hostile weather, there's another fundamental problem that's about to get you killed. You don't belong here. Medieval warfare wasn't just about individual combat skill set, it was built on a complex social hierarchy that determined everything from your position in battle formation to whether anyone would bother trying to save your life. And as an outsider with no feudal bonds, no sworn allegiances, and no place in the medieval social order, you're essentially fighting alone in a system designed around loyalty and obligation. The medieval military structure was fundamentally based on personal relationships that had been developing for generations. Lords fought alongside vassals who had sworn oaths of fealty. Knights led men-at-arms who had served their families for decades. Common soldiers fought beside neighbors from their villages, bound together by ties of kinship, shared experience, and mutual obligation that went far beyond simple military hierarchy. These bonds weren't just social niceties, they were survival mechanisms that determined who would risk their life to save yours, who would share their food when supplies ran low, and who would carry you to safety if you were wounded. Medieval armies were essentially extended family groups held together by webs of personal loyalty that created mutual support systems crucial for battlefield survival. You have none of these connections. You're fighting alongside men who owe you nothing, know nothing about you, and have no particular reason to care whether you live or die. In a military system where survival often depended on others being willing to take risks on your behalf, you're completely isolated and vulnerable. The knight commanding your section of the line represents everything that's wrong with your situation. Sir Geoffrey de Montfort holds his position not through merit or training, but through birth, inheritance, and a complex web of feudal obligations that stretch back generations. He knows every man in his command personally, their families, their abilities, their histories, their loyalty. When he gives orders, men obey not just because of military discipline, but because of personal bonds that have been forged over years of shared service. His relationship with you, however, is purely transactional. You're a temporary addition to his force, probably conscripted or hired for this specific campaign, with no long-term value to his household or his ambitions. If saving your life would put his proven men at risk, the calculation is simply expendable in ways that his sworn followers are not. Medieval military tactics relied heavily on unit cohesion that was built on these personal relationships. When a formation came under pressure, it held together because each man knew that breaking would abandon his brothers, his neighbors, his lord. The shame of failing these personal obligations was often a stronger motivator than fear of death. Your motivation structure is entirely different and fundamentally weaker. You're fighting for pure survival, which is certainly a powerful drive, but it doesn't create the same willingness to sacrifice for others that held medieval units together. When the pressure becomes intense and it's about to, your instinct will be to save yourself rather than maintain formation, making you a weak link that threatens everyone around you. The armor and weapons you're carrying tell their own story about your social position. Medieval equipment was expensive, and its quality directly reflected the wealth and status of its owner. Knights wore custom-fitted plate armor that cost more than a peasant family would earn in a lifetime. Professional men-at-arms carried weapons that had been crafted by master smiths and maintained by specialists. Your gear, clearly cobbled together from whatever was available in the army stores, marks you immediately as someone of no importance. The mismatched pieces, the poor fit, the obvious wear and previous repairs all signal to anyone who looks at you that you're not worth significant investment or protection. In a social system where status determined treatment, you're wearing a sign that says disposable. Medieval military hierarchy was rigidly enforced and absolutely crucial for battlefield coordination. Orders flowed down through chains of command based on feudal relationships, with each level responsible for the men beneath them. But these chains only worked when everyone understood their place and their obligations to those above and below them. As an outsider, you don't fit into these command structures in any meaningful way. You're theoretically under Sir Geoffrey's command, but he has dozens of men who are more important to his success than you are. When tactical decisions need to be made quickly and medieval combat requires split-second coordination, are likely to be ignored, forgotten, or simply left behind. The men fighting beside you have formed what medieval chroniclers called sword brothers, bonds forged through shared danger that created mutual obligations for protection and support. These relationships developed over months or years of campaigning together, built on demonstrated courage, reliability, and skill in combat. You've had no opportunity to form such bonds, and your obvious inexperience makes you an unlikely candidate for inclusion in these crucial relationships. The veterans around you will instinctively look out for their proven sword brothers while leaving newcomers and unknowns to fend for themselves. Medieval military medicine, primitive as it was, operated on a triage system that explicitly prioritized treatment based on social status and military value. Knights received the best available care, experienced sergeants got moderate attention, and common soldiers were treated only if resources permitted. As an outsider with no social connections, you're at the bottom of this priority system. If you're wounded, the barber surgeons will treat more valuable patients first, potentially leaving you to bleed out while they attend to men whose survival is considered more important to the army's success. Your lack of social position isn't just a matter of prestige, it's literally a matter of life and death when medical resources are limited. The tactical positioning within the battle formation also reflects social hierarchy in ways that put you at maximum disadvantage. Knights and experienced men-at-arms occupy the positions that offer the best protection and the most tactical flexibility. New recruits and expendable troops are placed in positions where they're most likely to absorb enemy attacks while protecting more valuable fighters. You're positioned in the front ranks not because of your skill or courage, but because your life is considered less valuable than those behind you. Medieval tactics deliberately used expendable troops to absorb the initial impact of enemy attacks, buying time and space for more experienced fighters to deploy effectively. The intelligence networks that medieval armies relied on for tactical and strategic information were built around the same social relationships that determined military hierarchy. Lords had networks of informants and allies who provided information about enemy movements, terrain, and tactical opportunities. As an outsider, you have no access to these information networks. You don't know what the overall tactical situation is, what your army's objectives are, or what dangers might be developing beyond your immediate vicinity. You're fighting blind in more ways than one, lacking the social connections that would provide crucial situational awareness. Medieval military supplies were distributed according to social priority systems that ensured knights and valuable fighters received the best equipment, food, and support. Common soldiers got what was left over, and outsiders like yourself were at the bottom of every distribution list. Your weapons are the cheapest available. Your armor is whatever didn't fit anyone more important, and your rations are the least appetizing parts of whatever food the army managed to acquire. This isn't just a matter of comfort. Inferior equipment and nutrition directly impact your combat effectiveness and survival chances. The honor codes that governed medieval military behavior created protection for some fighters while leaving others completely vulnerable. Knights were bound by chivalric codes that offered some protection to other knights, even enemies, under certain circumstances. These codes didn't extend to common soldiers, and certainly not to outsiders with no social standing. If you're captured, you can't expect the courteous treatment that might be extended to a knight who could pay ransom or whose family might seek revenge. You're more likely to be killed out of hand or enslaved, depending on your captor's immediate needs and inclinations. The religious frameworks that motivated medieval armies and justified their violence were closely tied to the same social hierarchies that determined military organization. Holy war was considered the special province of Christian knights, while common soldiers were viewed more as instruments of noble will than as independent moral actors. Your lack of connection to these religious and social frameworks means you can't draw on the psychological support systems that helped medieval warriors justify violence and cope with its psychological impact. You're fighting without the cultural anchors that made medieval warfare psychologically sustainable for its participants. Historians still argue whether medieval military hierarchy was more efficient than modern professional military organization. But what's certain is that it created tight bonds of loyalty and mutual obligation that were crucial for battlefield survival. These bonds took years to develop and were based on shared culture, religion, and social experience that you completely lack. The enemy forces you're facing have their own social hierarchies and loyalty networks, but they also have something you lack entirely. They belong to this world. They understand the rules, the relationships, and the expectations that govern medieval military behavior. They know who they're fighting for, why they're fighting, and what they can expect from their comrades. Sir Geoffrey is already looking past you toward men he considers more valuable, making tactical decisions that prioritize fighters with proven loyalty and capability over expendable newcomers like yourself. When the crisis comes, and it's coming soon, he'll sacrifice you without hesitation to save men who matter more to his long-term success. You're not just fighting enemy soldiers. You're fighting an entire social system that views you as expendable, unimportant, and ultimately disposable. In medieval warfare, not belonging isn't just a social disadvantage, it's a death sentence waiting to be carried out. While you're dealing with equipment failures, inadequate training, psychological terror, medieval medicine, hostile weather, and social isolation, there's another fundamental aspect of medieval warfare that's about to destroy you: the logistics of keeping an army fed, supplied, and functional in the field. Medieval military campaigns were exercises in controlled starvation, and you're about to discover that hunger, thirst, and disease can kill you just as effectively as enemy weapons, often more slowly and painfully. The romantic image of medieval armies marching across the countryside with banners flying obscures a brutal reality. These forces were essentially organized famines that consumed everything in their path and left soldiers constantly on the edge of starvation. Medieval logistics couldn't support large armies for extended periods, which meant that campaigns were races against time where victory often went to whichever side could avoid starving to death first. Your modern digestive system, accustomed to regular meals, processed foods, and reliable nutrition, is completely unprepared for medieval military rations. What passes for food in this army would be considered inedible by modern standards: moldy bread, rancid meat, and water that's barely safe for livestock consumption. Your stomach is already rebelling against the alien substances you've been forced to consume. Medieval armies typically carried enough supplies for only a few days of active campaigning, expecting to live off the land through foraging, requisition, and outright plunder. This system worked reasonably well for medieval soldiers who had grown up eating similar foods and whose digestive systems had adapted to irregular meals and questionable nutrition. Your modern gut bacteria, evolved for processed foods and consistent nutrition, is about to stage a revolt that will leave you weak, dehydrated, and vulnerable. The bread that forms the staple of medieval military rations is nothing like the refined wheat products you're used to consuming. This is coarse, dark bread made from whatever grains were available, often mixed with sawdust, ground peas, or other extenders to stretch limited supplies. It's frequently moldy, sometimes rancid, and always far harder and denser than anything your teeth have been designed to handle. Medieval soldiers developed powerful jaw muscles and wore down their teeth chewing these hard rations, adaptations that took years to develop. Your modern teeth, softened by a lifetime of processed foods, are going to crack and break trying to consume medieval military bread. Dental problems in medieval times weren't just painful, they were often fatal. since infected teeth could lead to systemic infections that medieval medicine couldn't treat. The meat you're occasionally served has been preserved through salting, smoking, or drying processes that remove most of its nutritional value while concentrating salt and other preservatives to levels that would be considered toxic by modern standards. This preserved meat is so loaded with salt that it actually increases dehydration rather than providing nutrition, creating a cycle where eating makes you thirstier while clean water remains unavailable. Medieval preservation techniques were designed to prevent spoilage rather than maintain nutritional value or palatability. The result was food that could keep for months without rotting but that provided minimal nutrition and often caused digestive problems for anyone not accustomed to consuming it regularly. The water situation is perhaps the most immediately dangerous aspect of medieval military logistics. Clean, safe drinking water was a luxury that medieval armies rarely enjoyed, especially during active campaigns. The water you're drinking has been drawn from streams contaminated by human and animal waste, stored in containers that haven't been properly cleaned, and often mixed with wine or ale to mask the taste of contamination. Medieval armies understood that bad water could kill faster than enemy weapons, but their solutions often created additional problems. Adding alcohol to water killed some bacteria but also contributed to dehydration and impaired judgment. Boiling water was sometimes practiced, but fuel was often scarce and the process was time-consuming and dangerous in combat situations. Your modern immune system, accustomed to chlorinated water and sterile environments, has no defense against the bacterial cocktail you're consuming with every drink. Medieval soldiers had built up resistance to local pathogens through lifetime exposure, but you're encountering completely foreign bacteria that your body can't fight effectively. The dysentery that's already beginning to affect your digestive system is one of the great killers of medieval armies. More soldiers died from dysentery and related diseases than from combat injuries, and the condition creates a cascade of problems that make survival increasingly unlikely. As your body loses fluids and nutrients through constant diarrhea, you become weaker, less alert, and more vulnerable to enemy action. Medieval armies had no understanding of proper sanitation or disease prevention. Latrines were poorly designed and inadequately maintained, allowing contamination to spread through water supplies and food preparation areas. The concept of washing hands to prevent disease transmission simply didn't exist in medieval military culture. The close quarters in which medieval armies lived and fought created perfect conditions for disease transmission. Soldiers shared sleeping spaces, eating utensils, and personal equipment without any understanding of how diseases spread. Respiratory infections, skin diseases, and parasitic infestations spread rapidly through medieval military camps. Medieval military rations were also severely deficient in vitamins and nutrients that modern nutrition science considers essential. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, was common in armies that spent months without fresh fruits or vegetables. The symptoms: bleeding gums, loose teeth, skin lesions, and extreme fatigue would make you increasingly unable to fight effectively even if you avoided more acute illnesses. The caloric intake available to medieval soldiers was often insufficient for the extreme physical demands of military campaigning. Modern soldiers require roughly 500 to 4,000 calories per day during active operations, but medieval military rations often provided less than 2,000 calories daily, and much of that was from low-quality sources that provided little usable energy. Your modern metabolism, tuned for regular meals and consistent energy sources, is going to crash when faced with irregular feeding and inadequate nutrition. Hypoglycemia, muscle wasting, and cognitive impairment will set in within days, making you increasingly ineffective as a fighting force. Medieval armies dealt with food shortages through foraging expeditions that were essentially organized raids on civilian populations. These expeditions were dangerous, time-consuming, and often unsuccessful, but they were necessary for army survival. As a newcomer with no experience in medieval foraging techniques, you'd be useless on these expeditions and unable to supplement your inadequate rations. The psychological impact of constant hunger and poor nutrition compounds all the other stresses you're facing on the medieval battlefield. Hunger affects decision-making, reduces pain tolerance, and increases irritability and depression. Medieval soldiers learned to function while chronically malnourished, but your modern psychology has no framework for coping with sustained nutritional deprivation. Medieval military supply chains were vulnerable to weather, enemy action, and simple mechanical failure in ways that modern logistics systems have largely eliminated. A broken wagon could leave hundreds of soldiers without food for days. Enemy raids on supply trains could starve entire armies. Bad weather could make roads impassable and supplies unreachable. The ammunition resupply for medieval armies was equally problematic. Arrows, crossbow bolts, and other consumable supplies were difficult to manufacture in the field and expensive to transport. Medieval armies often ran out of ammunition in the middle of battles, forcing them to scavenge from corpses or improvise weapons from whatever materials were available. Your lack of experience with medieval improvisation techniques means you can't adapt when supplies run low. Medieval soldiers knew how to make arrows from found materials, repair equipment with battlefield salvage, and create weapons from farming tools or construction materials. These skills took years to develop and were crucial for surviving extended campaigns. Medieval armies also had to deal with equipment maintenance challenges that modern militaries have largely solved through superior materials and manufacturing. Medieval weapons and armor required constant care to remain functional, but the oils, whetstones, and repair materials needed for maintenance were often in short supply during campaigns. The deterioration of your equipment will accelerate rapidly under campaign conditions, especially given your lack of maintenance knowledge. Rust, wear, and battle damage that medieval soldiers could repair or work around will render your gear increasingly useless and dangerous. Historians still argue whether medieval armies were actually less well-supplied than contemporary forces, or whether medieval chroniclers simply recorded supply problems more frequently because they were considered more newsworthy than successful logistics. What's certain is that medieval military campaigns were constantly threatened by logistical failures that could destroy armies without any enemy action. The enemy forces you're facing have their own supply problems, but they also have experience managing scarcity and operating under difficult logistical conditions. Their ability to function effectively while hungry, thirsty, and undersupplied gives them significant advantages over forces that depend on regular resupply and adequate nutrition. Medieval logistics created a vicious cycle where armies had to keep moving and fighting to find new sources of supply, but movement and fighting increased their consumption of resources and made supply more difficult. Armies that stopped moving often starved, while armies that moved too aggressively outran their supply lines and starved anyway. The campaign you're part of is already showing signs of logistical strain. Rations are being reduced, water is being rationed, and soldiers are beginning to show the physical signs of malnutrition and dehydration. The army is essentially racing against its own consumption rate, trying to achieve military objectives before it consumes itself. Your modern expectations of regular meals, clean water, and adequate nutrition are not just luxuries in medieval warfare theory fantasies that have no connection to medieval military reality. You're going to fight while hungry, thirsty, sick, and increasingly desperate, joining thousands of medieval soldiers who discovered that logistics could be deadlier than any weapon. The supply train that's supposed to keep this army functional is already falling behind, harassed by enemy raids and slowed by weather conditions. Soon, you'll be fighting not just for victory, but for the basic necessities of survival in a system that views your life as less important than preserving supplies for more valuable fighters. Welcome to medieval logistics, where hunger is a weapon, thirst is an enemy, and supply failure can destroy armies more effectively than any military strategy. You're about to learn that in medieval warfare, you can die just as easily from what you don't have as from what your enemies do have. After struggling through 8 different categories of medieval warfare disadvantages, the moment of truth has finally arrived. The enemy lines are close enough now that you can see individual faces beneath helmets. Read the expressions of men who are about to try to kill you, and smell the unwashed violence of an approaching medieval army. Every possible way that you could die in medieval combat is about to converge on your location simultaneously, creating a perfect storm of medieval lethality that will demonstrate exactly why your comfortable modern life has prepared you for absolutely nothing that's about to happen. The crossbow bolt that's going to end your medieval adventure is already in flight, launched by a Genoese crossbowman who's been shooting people professionally for the past 15 years. You can't see it coming because your helmet restricts your vision, can't hear the warning shouts because the metal is muffling sound, and can't dodge effectively because your armor weighs more than your modern body can handle with any kind of agility. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen we didn't mention earlier? Well, medieval armies didn't have any kind of effective sun protection either, but that's the least of your problems right now. The bolt punches through your mail shirt exactly as medieval military engineering intended, the bodkin point sliding between iron rings that were never designed to stop this kind of concentrated kinetic energy. The mail doesn't break kit parts like a curtain, allowing the bolt to penetrate deeply into your chest cavity. The physics of medieval projectile weapons were brutal in their simplicity. A crossbow could store and release enormous amounts of energy very precisely, driving a steel point through armor with enough force remaining to penetrate several inches into the human body behind it. The wound channel created by a bodkin point was designed to cause maximum internal damage while being nearly impossible to treat with medieval medical techniques. Your modern understanding of trauma medicine makes your situation even more horrifying because you can recognize exactly what's happening to your body. The bolt has punctured your right lung, fractured at least 2 ribs, and driven fragments of mail rings into the wound channel. You're experiencing what medieval medicine called the wound that corrupts, a penetrating injury that introduces foreign matter into the body while creating internal bleeding that can't be controlled with available techniques. Medieval warriors who survived similar wounds often lived for days or weeks before succumbing to infection, blood loss, or the complications of foreign objects embedded in their bodies. Your death isn't going to be the quick, heroic end that movies portray. It's going to be a slow, painful deterioration as medieval medicine proves completely inadequate to address your injuries. But you're not going to get the luxury of a slow death, because the crossbow bolt was just the opening act in your medieval demise. The enemy foot soldiers are now close enough to engage in melee combat, and they've identified you as an easy target through the same visual cues that medieval predators used to select vulnerable prey from herds of potential victims. Your obvious inexperience, your inferior equipment, your lack of proper formation discipline, and your visible panic make you stand out like a wounded animal among the more competent fighters around you. Medieval combat was often about target selection. Experienced warriors learned to identify and eliminate weak opponents quickly while avoiding unnecessary risks against more dangerous enemies. The English man-at-arms who's charging toward you with a war hammer represents everything that's wrong with your situation crystallized into one deadly opponent. Thomas Blackwood has been fighting professionally since he was 14 years old, has survived at least 20 major battles, and has developed the kind of combat instincts that turn medieval warfare into an art form rather than mere violence. He can read your movements before you make them, predict your responses to his attacks, and exploit weaknesses in your defense that you don't even know exist. His Warhammer, a specialized anti-armor weapon designed specifically for killing people dressed exactly like Yui's, about to demonstrate why medieval weapons development was so brutally effective. The hammer blow that catches the side of your helmet demonstrates the cruel physics of medieval impact weapons. The narrow striking surface concentrates enormous force into a small area, while the weight of the hammerhead generates momentum that your neck muscles simply cannot absorb. Your helmet dents inward, crushing the padding against your skull and creating pressure waves that scramble your brain like an egg in a shell. Medieval weapons were designed by people who understood human anatomy and the physics of trauma far better than their medical knowledge might suggest. They knew exactly how much force was needed to crush bone, how to design impact surfaces that would penetrate armor, and how to create weapons that would disable opponents even when they couldn't achieve clean kills. The concussion you've just received would require immediate medical attention and weeks of recovery in a modern hospital setting. Instead, you're expected to continue fighting while your brain struggles with traumatic injury. Your vision doubles and blurs, and your balance system fails catastrophically. Medieval warriors learned to function with injuries that would hospitalize modern people, but you lack both the conditioning and the pain tolerance that made this possible. Your attempt to counterattack with your sword demonstrates every failure in medieval weapons training that we discussed earlier. The blade, already slippery from rain and blood, twists in your grip as you try to deliver what you think is a powerful cut. Instead of striking your opponent with the edge, you hit him with the flat of the blade, a mistake that medieval weapons masters knew would get students killed in real combat. Thomas laughs as your ineffective attack bounces harmlessly off his padded jack. He's wearing layers of quilted fabric that provide excellent protection against poorly delivered sword cuts while remaining flexible enough to allow the kind of movement that superior training makes possible. Your attack has accomplished nothing except revealing your complete incompetence to an opponent who now knows exactly how little threat you represent. His counterattack comes from an angle that your limited medieval combat experience never prepared you to defend against. Medieval swordsmanship involved complex combinations of cuts, thrusts, and grappling techniques that flowed seamlessly from one to another. While you're still recovering from your failed attack, he's already transitioned to a thrust aimed at the gap between your helmet and your mail coif. The point of his rondel dagger, a specialized weapon designed for exactly this kind of close combat, slides between the layers of your protection and penetrates deeply into your neck. The wound severs blood vessels and damages your airway while introducing the kind of bacterial contamination that will make infection inevitable if you somehow survive the immediate blood loss. Medieval combat often ended with this kind of grappling and dagger work rather than the dramatic sword fights that modern entertainment depicts. Experienced warriors knew that once they closed to contact distance, specialized weapons like rondel daggers were far more effective than long swords for penetrating armor and delivering fatal wounds. You're now bleeding from multiple serious wounds while trying to fight in armor that has become a mobility-restricting death trap. The weight that was merely exhausting when you were healthy is now impossible to manage with blood loss and traumatic injuries. Your vision is narrowing, Your strength is failing, and your modern medical knowledge is providing you with a detailed understanding of exactly how and why you're dying. But medieval warfare isn't finished with you yet. The muddy ground that has been threatening your balance throughout this entire ordeal finally claims its victim as your weakened legs give out and you collapse face first into the churned earth of the battlefield. Your armor, designed to protect you while standing, becomes a trap that makes getting back up nearly impossible. Medieval battlefields were notorious for the number of soldiers who died not from direct combat but from being unable to rise after falling. The weight of armor, the slippery conditions, and the chaos of ongoing combat created situations where fallen warriors were essentially helpless until someone arrived to finish them off or help them up. Thomas approaches your fallen form with the methodical precision of someone who has performed this ritual many times before. Medieval warfare had clear protocols for dealing with fallen opponents, and mercy wasn't typically part of the equation. Disabled enemies were usually killed immediately to prevent them from recovering and rejoining the fight. The rondel dagger that ends your medieval adventure penetrates through the gap under your arm where your mail shirt meets your side armor. The narrow blade slides between your ribs and punctures your heart with the surgical precision that medieval weapons design had perfected over centuries of trial and error. Your death comes not with the dramatic speeches and meaningful last words of fiction, but with the prosaic efficiency of medieval military practice. You die in the mud, far from home, killed by superior training, better equipment, and combat experience that your modern life could never have provided. Historians still argue whether medieval warfare was actually more lethal than modern combat, or whether the nature of medieval weapons simply created different patterns of injury and death. What's certain is that medieval combat was designed by people who understood killing far better than they understood healing, creating weapons and techniques that were brutally effective against opponents who lacked proper preparation. Your body joins thousands of others scattered across the battlefield, a medieval landscape of violence that would horrify modern sensibilities, but that represented simply another day's work for the warriors who created it. The ravens and wolves that will eventually dispose of your remains have seen this scene countless times before and will see it countless times again. The battle continues around your corpse as if you had never existed, because in the grand scheme of medieval warfare, you hadn't. Your death changes nothing, affects no one who matters, and leaves no trace except as one more anonymous casualty in a conflict whose causes you never understood and whose outcome you could never have influenced. Medieval warfare consumed people like you by the thousands, individuals who found themselves caught up in violence they were unprepared for, fighting in wars they didn't understand, dying for causes that provided no comfort in their final moments. Your modern advantages, your technological sophistication, your educational achievements, none of it mattered once you stepped onto a medieval battlefield wearing medieval armor and carrying medieval weapons against opponents who had spent their entire lives preparing for this exact scenario. The wind picks up across the battlefield, carrying away the sounds of ongoing combat and the smell of blood and death. The rain continues to fall, washing your blood into the same mud that has absorbed the blood of countless other warriors who learned too late that medieval warfare was a game where only lifelong players had any chance of survival. In the growing darkness of the medieval evening, your story ends not with victory or glory, but with the simple biological fact that modern people don't belong in medieval warfare. You wouldn't last a day on a medieval battlefield because medieval warfare was designed by medieval people for medieval people, and no amount of modern knowledge or technology could bridge the gap between what you are and what survival required. Now the rain falls heavier, washing the battlefield clean for tomorrow's violence, while your journey into medieval warfare reaches its inevitable conclusion. The soft patter of raindrops on metal armor creates a gentle rhythm that seems to whisper the final truth of medieval combat. Preparation, training, and lifelong conditioning matter more than courage, intelligence, or good intentions. In medieval warfare, there are no participation trophies, no second chances, and no modern conveniences to save you from the consequences of being unprepared. Your adventure in medieval warfare is over. The lesson, written in blood and mud, is complete, and somewhere in the distance, other battles rage on, fought by people who belong to this violent world in ways that modern visitors never could. Rest now, and dream of safer times when warfare was something you could watch from the comfort of your couch, rather than something that would kill you before you had time to understand what was happening. Sleep well, knowing that your modern world, for all its flaws, has moved beyond the brutal simplicities of medieval combat. Dream peacefully, secure in the knowledge that you'll never again have to face the reality of what it meant to fight and die in the mud and blood of a medieval battlefield. Sweet dreams, time traveler. Your medieval nightmare is finally over.